In the mystical kingdom of Ikaleland, there was a balance between both light and dark magic. The villagers lived in harmony, knowing that both the white witches, who used their magic for good, and the black witches, who held darker powers, played a crucial part in the kingdom's fabric. The royal family lived at the heart of this enchanted kingdom, under the rule of King Ikaleland, a wise and just leader, beloved by all. However, despite his fair rule, the king carried a deep sorrow that weighed heavily on his heart. His only son, Prince Akin, though Akin was adored by the people for his charm and handsomeness, there was something about him that cast a dark shadow over the royal family. The prince was often plagued by a dark urge that made him steal. Whether it was a piece of jewelry, a shiny trinket, or the food of the common folk, Akin's hands were always reaching for what didn't belong to him. King Ikaleland, despite his love for Akin, turned a blind eye to his son's actions. He believed that his love alone would be enough to fix his son's wrongdoings, and he didn't want to bring shame to his family or his kingdom. So every time Akin stole, the king would quietly replace what had been lost, masking the damage caused by his son's actions. The villagers, too, began to notice, though they were hesitant to speak out. Whispers spread that Akin's behavior was a sign of something dark controlling him, and though the king had tried his best to shield his son from the consequences, there was no escaping the growing tension that filled the air. It wasn't just small thefts that plagued Prince Akin. His actions began to escalate, and soon, he had a reputation not only for stealing from the people, but also for being selfish and reckless. He would take from anyone, regardless of their status or position. His most recent transgression came when he took a precious necklace from Miriam, a powerful black witch who had been selling her enchanted jewelry at the village market. Miriam's jewelry was sought after by the wealthiest citizens of Ikaleland, as each piece held a mystical power. One day, as Akin walked through the marketplace, his eyes were immediately drawn to a necklace that glimmered like the sun. It was a piece unlike any he had seen before, a necklace with stones that shifted in color as the light hit them. Akin felt the familiar itch in his hands, the desire to possess it overwhelming him. As the crowd bustled around him, he couldn't help himself. With a swift motion, he snatched the necklace and disappeared into the crowd. Miriam, ever vigilant, saw the prince's actions and immediately knew what had happened. Her eyes glowed with anger, and she muttered a curse beneath her breath. "So the Prince of Greed thinks he can steal from me," she whispered, knowing that the consequences of his actions would soon be far greater than he ever imagined. Little did Akin know, this was the final act that would lead to his downfall, and the curse that would transform him forever. By nightfall, the effects of the curse began to take hold. Akin lay in his bed, unaware of the disaster that had been set in motion. He felt a strange tingling sensation in his body, but he dismissed it as nothing more than a passing discomfort. That was, until he looked in the mirror. His body had begun to change. His hands, once human, were now clawed and scaly. His legs, too, had grown shorter and more reptilian. Before he could comprehend what was happening, his face twisted into the snout of a lizard, and his body shrank until he was no longer a man but a giant lizard. Panic struck him as he tried to cry out, but his voice was lost. Instead, a loud hiss escaped from his throat. He stumbled across his chamber, his mind racing. The prince, once noble and proud, now crawled across the floor as nothing more than a reptile. His greed and carelessness had finally caught up with him in a form he could no longer escape. He was a creature marked by his own selfishness, and the curse Miriam had cast upon him was now a permanent part of his existence. His transformation into a lizard had begun, and there was no going back, not unless he learned the lessons his heart had long been ignoring. The next day, the kingdom was thrown into chaos. The once proud prince had been transformed into a lizard, and the people couldn't believe what had happened. King Ikaleland, devastated by his son's fall, rushed to the palace to see Akin for himself. What he saw left him in shock. His son, now a giant lizard, was lying motionless in his chambers, his human form completely gone. The king immediately sent for the oracle, a wise man who had the ability to see beyond the physical realm. The oracle entered the palace and examined Akin, confirming that the curse had indeed been cast by Miriam the witch. The prince's curse is not just for his theft. The oracle said, it is a punishment for his greed and arrogance. He must prove his repentance before he can regain his human form. King Alumide, though heartbroken, knew that he had no choice but to find a way to reverse the curse. But the oracle's words echoed in his mind. Only Akin's actions could lift the curse, and the road to redemption would be long and painful. As the king sat beside his son's lizard form, he realized the truth. Akin's fate was now in his own hands, and only by changing his ways could he undo the damage he had caused. The road to redemption had just begun, and it would take more than love and forgiveness to break the curse. The days following Akin's transformation were filled with uncertainty and despair. The people of Ikaleland could hardly believe their eyes when they saw their once proud prince reduced to a giant lizard. King Alumide, though deeply saddened, knew that action was needed to restore his son. The oracle had spoken clearly. Only Akin's repentance could break the curse. With that knowledge, the king summoned his son's most trusted advisors, hoping they could find a way to undo the curse. But even as the king sought counsel, a growing realization weighed on him. Akin would have to face the consequences of his actions alone. For true redemption, his son would have to earn back the trust of the kingdom, a trust he had broken with his own hands. As Akin lay in his lizard form, he couldn't speak or move as he once had. His thoughts were consumed with shame and regret. And though he wished for his old life back, he realized that to regain his humanity, he had to repay his debt to the people he had wronged. The first step on Akin's journey to redemption was a simple but daunting task. He needed to return all that he had stolen. Akin knew that the people of Ikaleland had suffered because of his greed, and that the only way to begin undoing the damage was to give back what he had taken. But with his transformation, the prince couldn't walk or speak as he had before. He was a creature of shame, bound by the curse and unable to interact with his kingdom the way he once had. It was in the quiet of his lizard form that Akin realized that the true power of redemption was not in grand gestures, but in humble acts of service. Returning what had been stolen was just the beginning, and Akin had to face the judgment of those he had wronged. But he didn't know where to start. He could no longer rely on the protection of his father. He had to earn the forgiveness of the kingdom, one step at a time. Prince Akin began his journey by crawling through the village streets, his reptilian form a symbol of his brokenness. His first stop was to Elder Femi's home, the village elder who had once been the victim of Akin's theft of sacred jewels. Akin, in his lizard form, crawled to Elder Femi's house, feeling the weight of his actions. The villagers who had once revered him now turned their heads in fear and disdain. As Akin reached the doorstep of the elder, he could see the old man's weary eyes. Elder Femi, though a wise and kind soul, was deeply hurt by Akin's theft. When Akin presented the stolen jewels, his hands trembling, Elder Femi simply stared at him. There was no anger in his eyes, but there was sadness. "I knew it was you, Prince Akin, even before you came to confess," Elder Femi said softly. "But what I see now is not the same young man who took these jewels. You have changed, and for that, I will accept your apology." With that, the elder took the jewels, and Akin, still in his lizard form, gave a silent nod of gratitude. The forgiveness was small, but it was a start. Akin knew that he could not erase the hurt he had caused, but each time he returned something, he felt the curse's grip loosening just a little. He still had so much to do before he could truly be free, but the journey of redemption had begun. As Akin continued to crawl through the kingdom, returning stolen goods and apologizing to those he had wronged, he began to feel a shift within himself. It wasn't just the physical act of returning what he had taken. It was the humility that came with it. Akin had always been selfish, but as a lizard, he felt powerless and weak. He couldn't rely on his status or his father's influence to shield him from the consequences of his actions. He was no longer a prince. He was just a man trying to fix the damage he had caused. The more he apologized and returned stolen treasures, the more the villagers began to soften toward him. At first, many were skeptical. They couldn't simply forget that the prince had been the cause of their suffering. But slowly, they began to see a change in Akin. He wasn't the prince of greed anymore. He was a man humbled by his own mistakes. He gave up his pride, and in its place, he embraced the humbling experience of making things right. Yet, as he continued to ask for forgiveness, Akin knew that there was one final person he had to face. His father, King Alumide. The most difficult part of Akin's journey toward redemption was not the stolen jewels or the disgruntled villagers. It was facing King Alumide, his father, the man he had hurt the most. Despite the prince's transformation, King Alumide had been heartbroken by his son's actions. Akin's greed had shattered the king's trust, and no matter how much Akin apologized, it didn't erase the pain he had caused. King Alumide loved his son, but he was also a man of honor, and Akin's betrayal had hurt not only him, but also the entire kingdom. Akin knew that, in order to fully break the curse, he needed his father's forgiveness, but that was no easy task. He had stolen the trust of the man who had always believed in him. But Akin was ready to face the consequences of his actions. He crawled to his father's chamber, his heart heavy with guilt. When King Alumide saw his son in his lizard form, he was overcome with emotion. Akin, despite being a lizard, had become unrecognizable not only in appearance but in spirit. The prince's once arrogant nature was now humble, and for the first time, the king could see the regret in his son's eyes. "Father, please forgive me," Akin thought, wishing he could say the words. King Alumide, seeing the change in his son, whispered, "You have hurt me deeply, Akin, but I see that you are not the same prince who stole from the people." And in that moment, King Alumide's heart softened, and the first step of forgiveness began. With King Alumide's forgiveness still lingering in his heart, Prince Akin knew that his journey wasn't over. Though his father had softened and begun to see the change in him, Akin understood that there was one more test he had to face: the villagers. The kingdom had suffered because of his greed and selfishness, and the people had lost much. They had come to fear him, and though many had slowly accepted his apologies, others still held on to the bitterness of his actions. Akin, in his lizard form, knew that if he was to truly redeem himself, he would have to win their trust and show that he had learned the value of humility. His next stop was the marketplace, where he had once stolen from the old witch Miriam. The marketplace was busy with villagers, their faces full of life and energy, but Akin couldn't help but notice the glaring absence of trust in their eyes. They had all been victims of his thefts. As he slithered through the crowd, he heard murmurs of disdain and fear. "Isn't that the prince?" One woman whispered, "How can he be a man of redemption?" Another man questioned. Akin, though still a lizard, understood that he had much more to do to prove that his heart had truly changed. In the heart of the marketplace, Akin stopped in front of Miriam's stall. She stood there, just as she had when he first stole the necklace from her, but now she regarded him with a calm, knowing gaze. Miriam, unlike the other villagers, did not fear him. She had seen what had happened to Akin, and in her wisdom, she knew that the prince's transformation wasn't merely physical, it was spiritual. Akin, trembling in his lizard form, placed the necklace that he had stolen on her table. He bowed low, unable to speak, but his actions were a clear sign of his regret. "I've returned what was yours," Akin thought, wishing his words could reach her. Miriam studied him for a long time before speaking. "You have come far, Prince, but there is more to be done." Her voice was quiet but filled with an undeniable wisdom. "The curse has only been lifted in part. To truly free yourself, you must give back what you've taken, not just in things but in trust, in hearts." Akin nodded in silence, understanding that Miriam's words held the key to his final step toward redemption. As she took the necklace back, she added, "I see the change in you, but now you must face the people. It's their trust that you must win." Miriam's words echoed in Akin's mind as he slithered through the streets, feeling the weight of his transformation pressing down on him. He understood that his redemption wouldn't be complete until the villagers forgave him, not just for the things he had stolen, but for the trust he had broken. His heart felt heavy as he approached the village square, where a festival was being held. The air was filled with laughter and music, but Akin could sense the unease lingering among the people. As he watched the festivities, he saw familiar faces, the children he had once played with, the farmers he had stolen from, and the elders who had once admired him. They all looked at him with mixed emotions. Some whispered to one another, wondering if they could ever forgive the prince who had turned their village into a place of fear. Akin knew that he had to face them. He had to prove that he was no longer the man he once was. But how could he convince them that he had truly changed? As the crowd began to gather, Akin crawled to the center of the square, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath, his thoughts racing. He couldn't speak, but he had learned that action spoke louder than words. Akin's moment of truth arrived when the villagers began to gather around him in the center of the marketplace. The prince, still a lizard, stood before them, humble and repentant, his heart full of regret for the pain he had caused. He could feel their eyes on him, some filled with suspicion, others with fear. The people had suffered because of him, and Akin knew that it would take more than just his apologies to win back their trust. Without a word, he slowly began to distribute the stolen goods he had recovered, the goats, chickens, and money that had once belonged to the villagers. One by one, he returned everything he had taken, including the jewels he had stolen from the elderly villagers. The crowd watched in silence, unsure of what to make of this strange scene. But as Akin continued to return each item, the murmurs of disbelief began to fade, and the villagers slowly began to understand. Akin was not just returning stolen items, he was returning their trust. The act of giving back what he had stolen was a symbol of his change. As he finished, Akin lowered his head in silent remorse. He knew that the road to full redemption wasn't over, but he had taken the first real step toward regaining the trust he had once broken. The village of Ikaleland was filled with whispers after Akin's act of repentance. The people were no longer as fearful of him, because the curse was now lifted and Akin transformed back to human form. But their forgiveness had not yet been fully earned. King Al-Umayyad, still reeling from the betrayal of his son, observed Akin's actions with cautious hope. He could see the prince's effort to change, but forgiveness, true forgiveness, was still a distant goal. Akin, now having returned the stolen goods and sought the villagers' forgiveness, still felt empty. His transformation into a lizard had stripped away his former arrogance and pride, leaving him a humble man in the eyes of the people. But what he hadn't yet realized was that there was one final step left in his redemption. He needed to earn back his father's trust. King Al-Umayyad had been the pillar of his life, and though Akin had shown remorse, he knew that only true change could heal the wounds he had caused. As the kingdom began to settle back into its routine, Akin began to realize the depths of his responsibility, not just as the prince, but as a future ruler. He would have to prove himself in the eyes of his father and before the people that he was worthy of forgiveness, respect, and one day, the throne. The time came when King Al-Umayyad called for a grand feast in honor of his son's journey toward redemption. Akin was invited to sit at the table beside his father, a gesture that meant far more than any of the riches they had once known. The kingdom's most influential villagers were present, all having witnessed the prince's transformation from a greedy thief to a repentant heir. As the feast began, the king stood to give a speech. He gazed down at his son, who sat humbly. Beside him, no longer the selfish young man who had stolen from his own people. This kingdom has seen much darkness and much light. My son Akin has brought us through one of our darkest moments, and I stand before you today to say that he has earned my forgiveness," King Alumide began. The people were silent as they listened. Forgiveness is not easy, nor is it a simple gift. It must be earned, and Akin has worked hard to prove that he has learned the lessons that his past mistakes could not teach him. The villagers who had once feared Akin now recognized the humility he had shown. There was a murmur of approval through the crowd. But as King Alumide continued, Akin's heart began to sink. His father had spoken of forgiveness, but Akin knew that the final test of his redemption was still to come. He had to prove himself worthy of trust once again. The next morning, Akin woke to find the kingdom in an unexpected crisis. The kingdom's harvest had been plagued by an unseasonal drought, and the people were suffering. The crops had failed, and many of the villagers had lost their livelihoods. Akin, still carrying the weight of his past, realized that this was his moment to prove his growth. He went straight to the royal chambers where King Alumide sat with his advisors, discussing the crisis. The king looked weary, his face full of concern for the people. Akin stood in the doorway, watching the struggle in his father's eyes. Without thinking, Akin spoke up. "Father, I have learned a lesson that cannot be unlearned. It's not enough to just lead with words. It's time for me to lead with action. Let me help." The king looked at him, surprised but not angry. He gave Akin a small nod. "Very well, show me then." Akin immediately took charge, organizing the village's farmers and merchants. He began to speak to them, offering his own personal resources to ensure the drought's effects were minimized. Using his wealth and influence, Akin helped set up a food bank, organized water distribution from the royal well, and made sure that no one went without during the difficult times. The villagers, though hesitant at first, began to see Akin's true character. The Prince of Greed had now become the Prince of Compassion. He was no longer the man who had stolen from them. He was the man who now stood beside them in their greatest time of need. As the drought passed and the kingdom began to recover, Akin's place in the hearts of the villagers was firmly restored. King Alumide, standing beside his son as the villagers cheered, realized that Akin had finally earned his redemption. The king looked down at his son, who was now a true leader in every sense of the word. He had earned the trust of his people, restored their faith in him, and demonstrated that he was ready to take on the responsibilities of a ruler. "You have not just redeemed yourself, Akin," the king said, his voice filled with pride. "You have shown the entire kingdom what it means to lead with honor, integrity, and heart. And that is why I, your father, am proud to pass on the throne to you when the time comes." The people cheered, their voices rising as they recognized Akin's true transformation. The once cursed prince had become a man of honor, a future king whose heart was no longer filled with greed, but with the desire to protect and serve his people. As Akin knelt before his father, he understood that his redemption wasn't just about the lifting of the curse. It was about becoming the person he had always meant to be. The curse had taught him that true greatness comes not from power or wealth, but from the willingness to change, serve, and embrace responsibility. Akin had redeemed himself, and in doing so, he had become the ruler Ikaleland needed. Years passed, and Akin ruled the kingdom of Ikaleland with wisdom and compassion. The once cursed prince who had turned into a lizard now stood as a king, beloved by his people. His reign was marked by peace, prosperity, and a deep connection to his people. The kingdom flourished, and Akin was remembered as a king who had risen from the depths of his own mistakes to lead with a humble heart. His story became a legend, told from one generation to the next, as a reminder of how greed, jealousy, and pride could destroy, but also how forgiveness and humility could rebuild. Akin, no longer the selfish prince, had proven that redemption was not just about seeking forgiveness, but about taking responsibility and making lasting change in the world. As an old man, Akin sat on the throne and thought back to the days of his curse. He thought of the lizard he had once been, and the curse that had stripped him of his humanity. He thought of the moments he had spent as a creature powerless and vulnerable. But now, as he sat among his family and the people he had worked so hard to protect, he understood that those days were part of his journey. They had shaped him into the ruler he was today, and he was grateful for the lessons they had taught him. His father, King Al-Umayyad, had passed on, but his legacy lived on in his son. The legacy of redemption had passed from father to son, and Akin had proved that no one is beyond redemption, that even the darkest past can be transformed into a future of light. The kingdom of Ikaleland was a place of prosperity and harmony. People traveled from all over to witness the transformation of the prince who had once brought shame to his family. Akin's story became a beacon of hope for those who had gone astray, a reminder that no matter how deep the darkness, the path to redemption was always within reach. And as Akin watched his own children play in the royal gardens, he felt at peace. He knew that his legacy would not be about the mistakes he had made, but about the lessons he had learned and the kingdom he had helped build. In the end, Akin's redemption had become a gift not just to him, but to the entire kingdom. And so, the kingdom of Ikaleland thrived, its people living in peace under the rule of a wise and humble king. Prince Akin, who had once been a lizard, now stood as a symbol of the power of forgiveness, growth, and transformation. His journey of redemption had taught the kingdom that even the greatest sins could be overcome. And the people of Ikaleland passed down his story through generations, telling their children about the prince who was once cursed, but who chose to walk the path of humility and love. Akin's story became a testament to the power of second chances, a legacy of redemption that would never be forgotten. Thanks for watching till the end. If this story gave you goosebumps, give it a like and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment below and let me know what city or country you're tuning in from. I read everyone. Till then, take care, folks.